talk about the basic social and economic dynamics of imperialism. The land grab that occurred between the late 19th century and the Second World War, in which European powers occupied some 85% of inhabitable land around the world. Why? And how did this work? This cartoon illustrates the basic dynamic, which is that colonies supplied raw materials for industrializing powers. They supplied gold and silver, particularly in the original colonies of South America, but more importantly, foodstuffs, cocoa, tea, coffee, sugar, and many other products, fruits such as bananas, and most importantly, raw materials. Things like cotton, wool, rubber, and oil. And also ores that could be converted into steel. Colonies were suppliers of raw materials to their mother countries or to the occupying colonial powers. These raw materials then fed into what we call the Second Industrial Revolution. You've all heard of the First Industrial Revolution, right? Where textile mills used steam power to mass produce things like clothing. The Second Industrial Revolution is all about steel and chemicals. It's the internal combustion engine. It's synthetic products. Countries like the United States and Germany, and later Japan, begin to challenge the dominance of Great Britain over much of the global economy and of the global political sphere as well. Great Britain in the 18th and 19th century was the unchallenged power. But the Second Industrial Revolution gave economic and material resources to rising countries, such as the United States and Germany. This entire process relied on raw materials from colonies in order to supply, to feed into the expanding number of factories and goods flying out of the new assembly line processes of the Second Industrial Revolution. This had consequences for people living in imperial countries. First of all, the elites, or the sort of middling sorts, could go off and become officers in colonial armies, gain prestige and renown, and live very comfortable lives, surrounded by servants and paid very well. Here's a group of British officers in Zimbabwe clearly enjoying their dominant position. But you didn't have to be directly involved in the colonial enterprise to benefit from it. In fact, almost every person living in the imperial powers in Europe, in the United States, benefited indirectly from the colonial project. They benefited in things that are not immediately obvious, like this: cotton for mass-produced clothing, so that people of few means could have more expansive wardrobes. Food supplies became less expensive because colonial raw materials brought down the price. Raw materials such as rubber provided the basic stuff to produce, for example, bicycles, which became widely available to working classes in places like Britain as a result of colonial supplies. Colonization also was a political project. It allowed people to adhere to a nationalist, to increase nationalist sentiment in an age of spreading democratic governance. So almost everyone, many people in Europe, in the United States, were indirectly involved in the colonial enterprise and certainly benefited from it. That's the imperial side. But the lives of the colonized peoples were transformed even more. The new imperialism, that is, the imperialist project that ran from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century, had significant impact on the lives of colonized people in things like land and property arrangements. So here you see an image of a Malaysian rubber plantation. In British Malaysia, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, rice paddies were converted into rubber plantations. It turns out that rice paddies in Malaysia were largely owned by women. Rubber plantations were owned by men. So this shift from rice, which mainly served to feed local populations, to rubber, which was an export product sent to England and used in English industry, this shift had implications in Malaysian society. Some historians ascribe this shift as one of the factors which contributed to the rise of a patriarchal form of Orthodox Islam in the early 20th century in British Malaysia. So land occupation changed dramatically in many, many ways in many different colonies. More basically, enormous amounts of labor were required in order to produce, to extract the raw materials, which would then feed into imperial industry. Here, another Malaysian rubber plantation being worked by Indian colonial subjects brought in specifically to work on the plantations. Now, colonial countries extracted labor in different ways. In countries like England, generally tended to allow local leaders to manage the process. Other countries like Belgium tended to rely more on force. So forced labor was one way by which colonizing powers extracted labor and extracted raw materials. Another way was more subtle, taxation. Here you see tax collectors for the French imperial state circulating through Dakar, Senegal, the French colony. In most colonies, populations were required to pay taxes to the occupying colonial power. To pay taxes, you need money. To get money, you need to work for wages. So populations shifted from many people who had spent their time and expended their labor in creating food for themselves and their family, raising cattle, planting crops, and so on, had to go out and work for wages in order to pay taxes. The work, of course, available would be with and for colonial occupying industries. So things like rubber extraction or food plantations. Now, once this process happened, when people left behind their subsistence lifestyles and went to work for industrial powers, they then needed to purchase goods for themselves in order to live. In this sense, the colonial enterprise produced captive markets. Colonial peoples purchased and were basically allowed to purchase only goods from that were shipped from the metropole. That is, British colonial subjects could only buy British industrially produced goods. French colonial subjects were limited to goods produced by French companies. They became captive markets. And one of the purposes of colonial expansion was to increase the size of this captive market so that the products produced in the Second Industrial Revolution had somewhere to go and people to purchase them. The result of all of this, so a combination of extraction by taxation, by wage labor, and by force, as you can see in this picture painted by a former colonial subject in Belgian Congo. Force had a lot to do with this in all colonial situations. This was not a voluntary colonial relationship. The result of all of this was that as standards of living, that is, what people have to live with, their clothes, their food, the goods in their homes, the basis of a good life. As all of these things increased dramatically in colonial countries, in the metropole, among working classes who could purchase bicycles, as we saw, as lifestyle improved for residents of Britain, France, the United States, Germany. Conversely, the conditions of life dramatically diminished for colonized peoples. Colonial powers specifically prevented colonized countries from developing their own industry because they wanted captive markets. So you see a divergence here. To sum up, here's the basic dynamic. The colonies supply raw materials to the metropole. Things like rubber, wool, cotton, oil, etc. These then serve the industrial expansion of the Second Industrial Revolution within the metropole. The products of the Industrial Revolution and its mass production are then shipped back to the colonies, which become captive markets for goods produced in Europe and the United States. The result of this is that as standards of living increase here in the metropole, they decrease in the colonies. This is not an abstract historical dynamic. This dynamic is at the root of what we now call the distinction between developed countries, countries with industrial mass production, and what we call undeveloped or underdeveloped countries, countries whose economies largely depend either on subsistence farming or on the extraction of raw materials. That distinction was created, was a specific policy implemented by imperial powers in order to promote growth of economic and military might within their own countries and to ensure that colonies remained, the function of the colony remained purely to supply raw materials and captive markets for industry in the metropole. The divide, the increasing global inequality that we see over the course of the 20th century is a direct result of this policy put into place by imperial powers in the late 19th century.